What happens to a kingdom when its architect finally stops breathing? On the evening of September 27, 2017, the grounds of 10236 Charing Cross Road fell into an unusual stillness. The Gothic Tudor mansion, that had for more than 4 decades served as the nerve center of an empire built on desire and spectacle, now stood in near total silence. If you are watching this, and if you find value in what unfolds here, consider subscribing. We are working toward our first 1,000, and your presence makes that possible. Inside, past the wrought iron gates and the sprawling lawns where peacocks still wandered in the fading California light, Hugh Marston Hefner lay in his bedroom on the 2nd floor, his body finally surrendering to what physicians would later describe as sepsis caused by an E. coli infection. He was 91 years old. The official statement, released hours later, spoke of a man who had passed peacefully, surrounded by loved ones. It mentioned his contributions to publishing, his role in shaping American culture, his legacy of advocacy. What it did not mention was how few people remained in the house that night, or how the mansion itself had already been sold more than a year prior. The property had changed hands in August of 2016. Darren Metropolis, heir to a private equity fortune, had acquired it for approximately $100 million, a sum that, adjusted for decades of inflation and myth, seemed almost modest for what the address represented. The sale included a condition that would have seemed unthinkable even a decade earlier. Hefner would be permitted to remain on the premises until his death. He was, in effect, a tenant in his own legend. The parties had long since ended. The grotto, once the site of gatherings that fueled tabloid headlines and whispered rumors across Hollywood, had grown quiet. The infamous game house, the aviary, the tennis courts, all of it persisted in a kind of suspended animation, maintained but no longer animated by the constant circulation of guests, photographers, and young women who had once defined the mansion's peculiar social economy. Those who visited in those final years often remarked on the stillness. The furniture remained unchanged, the decor frozen in a vision of mid-century glamour that had long since passed from fashion into something closer to artifact. Hefner himself rarely left the master suite, spending his days reviewing old photographs, watching classic films on a loop, and receiving a diminishing circle of visitors. His health had been declining for years, his hearing nearly gone, his mobility limited, his famous silk pajamas now less a symbol of leisure than a kind of uniform for confinement. The women who had once populated the mansion in rotating configurations had mostly departed. Crystal Harris, his third wife, remained, though her presence in those final months was itself a subject of speculation among those who still paid attention. The neighborhood of Holmby Hills, one of the wealthiest enclaves in Los Angeles, had long maintained an uneasy relationship with its most famous resident. The estate sat between properties owned by families whose fortunes derived from oil, entertainment, and inheritance, old money and new money coexisting in the manicured silence of private drives and tall hedges. For decades, the Playboy mansion had been an anomaly, a place where limousines arrived at odd hours, where helicopters occasionally landed on the lawn, where the ordinary rules of discretion that governed the neighborhood were suspended in favor of something louder, stranger, more deliberately visible. By 2017, that visibility had faded. The gates remained closed. The stream of visitors had slowed to a trickle. The mansion had become, in its way, a kind of mausoleum before its owner had even died. What the public knew of Hugh Hefner's final years came filtered through carefully managed statements and occasional photographs released by the company he had founded in 1953. The image remained consistent. The patriarch in his robe, surrounded by smiling faces, presiding over an empire that still bore his name. What the public did not see was the reality behind the image. The medical equipment discreetly positioned in the bedroom, the round-the-clock nursing staff, the slow erosion of the social rituals that had once given the mansion its purpose. The parties had not simply stopped. They had been gradually replaced by something closer to hospice care, administered in a setting designed for celebration. The mansion itself had not always belonged to Hefner. Before it became synonymous with his name, the estate at Charing Cross Road was simply another grand residence in a neighborhood filled with them. Built in 1927 for Arthur Letts Jr., the son of a department store magnate, the house was designed in the Gothic Tudor style that wealthy Angelenos of that era favored, a style meant to evoke the landed estates of England, transplanted to the hills above Sunset Boulevard. The original structure contained approximately 20,000 square feet, with 29 rooms arranged across multiple wings. There was a ballroom, a wine cellar, servants' quarters, and grounds that stretched across nearly 6 acres. It was, by any measure, a significant property, but it was not yet a symbol. Hefner acquired the estate in 1971 for slightly more than $1 million. He was 45 years old, and his empire was at its peak. Playboy magazine, which he had launched from his kitchen table in Chicago 18 years earlier, with $600 in borrowed capital, had grown into a publishing phenomenon, with a circulation exceeding 7 million copies per month. The company had expanded into clubs, casinos, hotels, and television production. Hefner himself had become something more than a businessman. He had become a persona, instantly recognizable in his smoking jacket and captain's hat, surrounded by women decades younger than himself, presiding over a vision of American masculinity that was equal parts sophistication and indulgence. The Los Angeles mansion was to be the physical embodiment of that vision. The transformation began almost immediately. Hefner commissioned extensive renovations, adding features that would become legendary in the decades to come. The grotto, an artificial cave structure built around a swimming pool, complete with hidden alcoves and underwater access, was constructed at considerable expense. A game house was added, containing arcade machines, pinball tables, and eventually a private discotheque. The grounds were expanded to include a tennis court, a gymnasium, and an elaborate aviary housing exotic birds. Peacocks and spider monkeys roamed freely. The landscaping was designed to create the impression of a private paradise, a world apart from the city that surrounded it. But the mansion's most significant feature was not architectural, it was social. From the beginning, Hefner conceived of the property as a stage for a particular kind of performance. The parties that began in the early 1970s and continued, with varying intensity, for more than 4 decades, were not spontaneous gatherings, but carefully orchestrated events. Guest lists were curated, photographers were positioned, the women who attended, playmates, actresses, models, and those who aspired to become any of the above, were selected according to criteria that Hefner himself established and enforced. The mansion functioned as a machine for producing images, and those images, disseminated through the magazine and later through television specials and reality programs, reinforced the mythology that Hefner had constructed around himself. The reality behind the mythology was more complex. Those who lived in the mansion during its years of operation described an environment governed by rigid, often unspoken rules. Curfews were enforced, visitors were monitored. The women who resided in the house, sometimes as many as 7 or 8 at a time, were expected to conform to schedules, dress codes, and behavioral expectations that left little room for independence. Hefner himself maintained control over nearly every aspect of domestic life, from the films screened in the mansion's private theater to the meals served in the dining room. The atmosphere, according to some accounts, was less that of a libertine utopia than of an institution, structured, hierarchical, and ultimately centered on the needs and preferences of a single individual. What the public saw was different. The public saw the parties, the celebrities, the constant parade of young women in various stages of undress. The public saw a man who seemed to have solved the riddle of modern masculinity, who had built a life entirely around pleasure and faced no apparent consequences for doing so. The mansion became a fixture in American popular culture, referenced in films, television shows, and countless magazine articles. It was photographed, filmed, and described so many times that its image became almost more real than the physical structure itself. Visitors who arrived expecting the fantasy often found something stranger: a house frozen in time, decorated in styles that had not been updated since the 1970s, populated by people performing roles in a script that never seemed to change. By the 1980s, the contradictions had begun to accumulate. The AIDS crisis transformed the landscape of American sexuality, and the carefree hedonism that Hefner had promoted suddenly seemed not merely outdated, but dangerous. The magazine's circulation declined. The clubs closed. Hefner himself retreated further into the mansion, rarely venturing beyond its gates, surrounded by an ever-rotating cast of companions who grew younger as he grew older. The parties continued, but their meaning had shifted. What had once seemed revolutionary now seemed merely eccentric. An aging man in a silk robe, presiding over rituals whose original purpose had long since been forgotten. The women who passed through 10236 Charing Cross Road over the decades numbered in the thousands. Some stayed for a single evening. Others remained for years, their lives structured entirely around the rhythms of the mansion and the man who owned it. Their testimonies, offered in interviews and memoirs published long after their departures, painted a picture that diverged sharply from the fantasy presented in the magazine's pages. They spoke of weekly allowances distributed in cash, of mandatory attendance at designated events, of a social hierarchy as rigid as any corporate structure. At the top sat Hefner. Below him, arranged in descending order of favor, were the women he had designated as his girlfriends, a term that carried specific contractual implications, though no formal contracts were ever signed. The system operated on a currency of access. To be close to Hefner was to have access to the parties, the celebrities, the photographers who could transform an unknown face into a centerfold. To fall out of favor was to lose that access instantly and completely. Women who displeased him, by gaining weight, by expressing independence, by forming attachments outside the mansion, found themselves removed from the inner circle with little warning and no appeal. The turnover was constant. New faces arrived as others departed, maintaining the illusion of perpetual youth that the brand required. Hefner himself seemed to age in a different dimension, his appearance changing gradually, while the women around him remained fixed in their early 20s, replaced before they could grow any older. The economics of this arrangement were rarely discussed publicly. The allowances, reportedly ranging from $1,000 to several $1,000s per week, were presented as gifts rather than compensation. The women were not employees in any legal sense. They were guests, companions, girlfriends. The distinction mattered for reasons that extended beyond semantics. It meant that no contracts existed to be violated, no workplace protections applied, no formal grievances could be filed. The mansion operated in a space between categories, neither fully private nor fully commercial, governed by rules that Hefner alone had the authority to interpret and enforce. Those who thrived in this environment learned to navigate its particular demands, They understood that visibility was currency, that proximity to Hefner translated into opportunities, magazine covers, television appearances, introductions to producers and directors who frequented the parties. Some leveraged their time at the mansion into careers that outlasted their residency. Others found themselves stranded when their moment passed, possessing no credentials beyond their association with a brand that valued them primarily for their youth. The mansion consumed these women in a specific way, extracting from them the raw material of fantasy, while offering in return a version of fame that proved difficult to convert into lasting independence. The men who visited occupied a different position entirely. They were guests in the traditional sense, invited, entertained, and sent home with stories that enhanced their own reputations. The guest books from those decades read like a catalogue of American celebrity. Actors, musicians, athletes, politicians, and businessmen whose presence lent the mansion an air of legitimacy that pure commerce could never have provided. These men arrived expecting a certain experience, and the mansion was designed to deliver exactly that. The women were part of the scenery, available for conversation, for photographs, for whatever might follow. The transaction was understood by all parties, even if it was never explicitly acknowledged. What happened in the grotto, in the game house, in the bedrooms that lined the mansion's upper floors, remained largely a matter of rumor and speculation. Hefner himself cultivated an air of knowing silence on these subjects, allowing imagination to fill the gaps that discretion left empty. The rumors served the brand as effectively as any advertisement. They suggested possibilities without confirming specifics, creating an aura of transgression that attracted visitors while providing legal deniability. The mansion existed in a perpetual state of implication, promising more than it could ever be proven to have delivered. By the 1990s, a generation had grown up with the Playboy mansion as a fixed point in the cultural landscape. It had appeared in so many films, television programs, and magazine features that its image had become almost archetypal, the definitive symbol of a particular vision of American success. Young men who had never seen the inside of the estate nonetheless understood what it represented. It was aspiration made concrete, desire given an address. That this vision was already decades out of date, that the magazine's influence had waned, that Hefner himself had become more symbol than substance. None of this diminished the mansion's hold on the popular imagination. The mythology had achieved a kind of autonomy, persisting long after the reality that generated it had begun to decay. The decision to open the mansion's doors to television cameras marked a turning point that few recognized at the time. In 2005, the E! Network premiered a reality series titled The Girls Next Door, which followed the daily lives of Hefner's three primary girlfriends, Holly Madison, Bridget Marquardt, and Kendra Wilkinson. The program presented a sanitized version of mansion life, emphasizing shopping trips, pet care, and the superficial dramas of cohabitation. Hefner appeared as a benevolent patriarch, elderly but affectionate, presiding over his household with the detached amusement of a man who had seen everything and been surprised by nothing. The show ran for 6 seasons and introduced the Playboy mansion to an audience that had never purchased the magazine. What the cameras captured was carefully controlled. Producers worked within boundaries established by Hefner and his representatives, focusing on content that reinforced rather than challenged the existing mythology. The girlfriends were presented as willing participants in an unconventional but ultimately harmless domestic arrangement. Their complaints, when voiced, concerned matters of jealousy and scheduling rather than anything more substantive. The mansion itself appeared as a kind of adult playground, eccentric but unthreatening, populated by beautiful women who seemed genuinely content with their circumstances. Millions of viewers accepted this version without question. The women who appeared on the program would later offer different accounts. Holly Madison, in a memoir published years after her departure, described an environment characterized by isolation, control, and psychological manipulation. She wrote of strict curfews, of being forbidden to pursue outside employment, of a social structure designed to keep the women dependent and competitive with one another. The allowances she revealed came with implicit expectations. The parties, far from being celebrations, were obligations that could not be refused. The image of the kindly old man in the silk pajamas, she suggested, concealed something considerably darker. A system of control refined over decades, operating behind the facade of liberation that the brand had always promoted. Other former residents offered similar testimonies. They spoke of rooms bugged with recording equipment, of medical examinations required before intimate contact, of a culture in which compliance was rewarded and independence punished. The specifics varied, but the underlying pattern remained consistent. The mansion functioned as a closed system, isolated from the outside world, governed by rules that served a single individual's interests. The women who entered this system often found themselves transformed by it, emerging years later with experiences they struggled to process and memories they could not easily reconcile with the public narrative they had helped to construct. Hefner's response to these revelations followed a predictable pattern. Through representatives, he dismissed the accounts as exaggerations, motivated by financial interest or personal resentment. The women, he implied, had known exactly what they were entering and had benefited substantially from the arrangement. Any suggestion of coercion or exploitation was rejected as incompatible with the values of consent and liberation that the Playboy brand had always championed. The defense relied on a particular interpretation of freedom, one in which the absence of physical force constituted proof of voluntary participation, regardless of the economic pressures or psychological dynamics that might have shaped individual choices. The mansion itself had begun to show signs of physical decline that mirrored its owner's deterioration. Health inspectors who visited the property in the early 2000s documented conditions that contradicted the image of luxury the estate projected. The famous grotto, with its heated pools and artificial caves, was found to harbor bacteria at levels far exceeding safe standards. Legionella, the pathogen responsible for Legionnaire's disease, was detected in water samples. Guests who had swum in those waters reported infections and illnesses that they only later connected to their visits. The revelation received minimal press coverage, absorbed into the larger mythology without fundamentally altering public perception. The grounds, too, had suffered from decades of intensive use and inconsistent maintenance. The exotic animals that had once roamed freely had died or been removed. The landscaping, though still maintained, had lost the manicured perfection of earlier decades. Inside the house, the furnishings remained unchanged. The same carpets, the same wood paneling, the same art on the walls. But age had transformed what was once fashionable into something closer to neglect. Visitors in the final years described an atmosphere of decay beneath the surface glamour, a sense that the entire enterprise was being held together by habit and reputation rather than any vital force. The business that had built the mansion was collapsing around it. Playboy Enterprises, once a diversified media company with holdings spanning publishing, entertainment, and licensing, had been contracting for years. The magazine that had launched the empire saw its circulation fall from millions to hundreds of thousands, then lower still. Advertising revenue declined as brands reconsidered their association with content that younger consumers increasingly viewed as outdated or offensive. The clubs had long since closed. The casinos had been sold. What remained was primarily a licensing operation, renting the rabbit head logo to manufacturers of products that ranged from clothing to energy drinks. The company that Hefner had built from nothing was being dismantled piece by piece, reduced to the management of intellectual property generated decades earlier. Hefner himself had been gradually removed from operational control. Though he retained the title of editor-in-chief and continued to appear in company materials, the actual decisions were made by executives who viewed the brand as an asset to be optimized rather than a vision to be preserved. In 2015, the company announced that the magazine would no longer feature fully nude photographs, a decision that would have been unthinkable under Hefner's direct leadership, a repudiation of the very premise on which the publication had been founded. The announcement was framed as an adaptation to changing times, an acknowledgement that the Internet had made such imagery freely available and therefore commercially valueless. Hefner endorsed the change publicly, though those close to him suggested his assent was more resignation than conviction. The sale of the mansion in 2016 represented the final severing of the connection between the man and the mythology he had created. Darren Metropoulos, the buyer, had made his fortune through investments in consumer brands, Hostess, Pabst Blue Ribbon, companies whose value lay in nostalgia as much as product. The Playboy mansion fit this pattern precisely. Metropoulos spoke of his plans to restore the property, to return it to its former grandeur, to preserve it as a piece of Los Angeles history. What he did not mention, at least not publicly, was any intention to continue the social functions that had defined the estate for more than 4 decades. The parties were over. The era had ended. What remained was real estate. Hefner's final year unfolded in increasing isolation. His health had deteriorated to the point where he rarely left his bedroom. The infections that would eventually kill him had begun their work, compromising his immune system, confining him to a diminishing sphere of activity. Crystal Harris, his wife since 2012, managed access to him with increasing strictness. Old friends found their calls unreturned. Former girlfriends who sought to visit were turned away. The circle around him contracted until only a handful of people remained: family members, medical staff, and the few associates whose loyalty had survived the decades of transactional relationships that the mansion had fostered. The outside world had largely moved on. The cultural conversation about sexuality, power, and consent had shifted in directions that left the Playboy philosophy stranded on the wrong side of history. The liberation that Hefner had claimed to champion was now re-examined through lenses that emphasized not freedom, but exploitation, not choice, but coercion. The mansion, once a symbol of aspirational masculinity, had become something more ambiguous, a monument to attitudes that younger generations found difficult to celebrate and impossible to ignore. The Me Too movement, which would emerge in full force just weeks after Hefner's death, would cast retrospective shadows over everything the mansion had represented. Inside the walls of 10236 Charing Cross Road, none of this mattered. The house maintained its silence, its routines, its careful preservation of a world that no longer existed beyond its gates. The staff continued their duties. The grounds were kept. The animals that remained, a few dogs, the surviving peacocks, wandered paths they had walked for years. Hefner himself existed in a kind of suspended animation, tended by nurses, visited occasionally by his children, watching the same films he had watched for decades on screens positioned around his bed. The man who had built an empire on the projection of fantasy had retreated entirely into private memory, surrounded by photographs of a past that grew more distant with each passing day. The death, when it came, was announced with the kind of carefully managed statement that had characterized every public communication from Playboy Enterprises for decades. The language emphasized legacy, Contribution, cultural impact. Tributes arrived from celebrities, politicians, and public figures who had passed through the mansion's doors over the years. They spoke of a visionary, a pioneer, a man who had changed American attitudes toward sexuality and free expression. The dissenting voices, those who questioned whether the change had been entirely positive, whether the cost had been fully accounted, were present but muted, drowned out by the immediate impulse toward eulogy that death typically provokes. Hefner had made arrangements for his burial years in advance. He had purchased a crypt at Westwood Village Memorial Park, directly adjacent to the resting place of Marilyn Monroe. The proximity was not coincidental. Monroe had appeared in the first issue of Playboy in December 1953, her nude photographs acquired by Hefner without her knowledge or consent from a calendar shoot she had done years earlier, when she was unknown and desperate for money. She had never visited the mansion, had never met Hefner, had died more than a decade before he even acquired the property. Yet in death, as in the magazine that had launched his empire, she would be positioned beside him. A final assertion of association with a woman who had never chosen that association in life. The funeral itself was private, attended by family and a small number of invited guests. The public memorial that followed was larger but still controlled, held on the mansion grounds in early October. Speakers praised Hefner's commitment to civil liberties, his support for various causes, his role in challenging censorship and promoting sexual freedom. The contradictions embedded in this legacy, the freedom he championed for himself and the control he exercised over others, the liberation he proclaimed and the hierarchy he enforced, went largely unmentioned. Such occasions are not designed for complexity. They are designed for closure, for the conversion of a human life into a narrative simple enough to be remembered. What happened to the mansion after Hefner's death followed the pattern established by the sale. Metropolis took full possession of the property and began the process of renovation he had long planned. The work was extensive. Systems that had not been updated in decades were replaced. The grotto, source of so many photographs and so much bacteria, was drained and reconstructed. The interiors were stripped of furnishings that had defined the space for more than 40 years. The Playboy Mansion, as it had existed in the popular imagination, was being systematically erased, replaced by something that would bear the same address but carry none of the same meaning. The artifacts of Hefner's life were dispersed through a series of auctions. Personal items, memorabilia, furniture and art accumulated over decades were catalogued, photographed, and sold to collectors whose interest lay in owning pieces of a mythology rather than understanding the reality that had produced it. The prices were substantial. A silk smoking jacket sold for several $1,000s. Original artwork from the magazine brought tens of thousands. The market for nostalgia proved robust, even as the cultural conversation increasingly questioned what exactly was being remembered and celebrated. For the women who had lived in the mansion, Hefner's death opened a space for speech that had not previously existed. Some had already told their stories, but many had remained silent, constrained by non-disclosure agreements, by fear of retaliation, by the simple difficulty of challenging a narrative that had been reinforced for so long by so many voices. In the months and years following his death, more accounts emerged. They described experiences that ranged from uncomfortable to traumatic, patterns of behavior that extended across decades and involved hundreds of individuals. The consistency of these accounts, the specific details that recurred across testimonies separated by years and offered by women who had never met, suggested something more systematic than the isolated incidents of a single flawed individual. The legal reckoning that might have accompanied these revelations never fully materialized. Hefner was dead, beyond the reach of prosecution or civil judgment. The corporate entities that had enabled and profited from the system he created had been restructured, sold, and dissolved in ways that complicated any attempt to assign institutional responsibility. The women who spoke found audiences willing to listen, but mechanisms of accountability largely absent. Their stories became part of the historical record without producing the consequences that such stories might have generated had they been told while their subject was still alive to answer them. The mansion stands today in its altered form. The address remains the same, 12236 Charing Cross Road, Holmby Hills, Los Angeles, but the property it identifies bears little resemblance to what existed before. The renovations undertaken by Metropolis transformed the estate into something more conventional, a private residence suitable for a wealthy family, rather than a venue for the particular social theatre that Hefner had staged for decades. The grotto remains, rebuilt and sanitized. The grounds retain their acreage, but the quality that once distinguished the property, its function as a stage, a symbol, a destination, has been deliberately removed. It is now simply a house, extraordinary in its size and location, but no longer singular in its purpose. The Playboy brand continues to exist, though in forms that would be unrecognizable to those who knew it at its height. The magazine ceased print publication entirely in 2020, retreating to a digital presence that generates a fraction of its former attention. The licensing business persists, attaching the rabbit logo to products marketed primarily on nostalgia for an era that grows more distant with each passing year. The company has changed ownership multiple times since Hefner's death, each transaction further diluting any connection to the vision that originally animated the enterprise. What remains is intellectual property, trademarks, archives, the residual value of recognition without relevance. In Holmby Hills, the neighbors who once complained about the noise, the traffic, the disruption to their carefully maintained tranquility have had their wishes granted. The gates of the former Playboy mansion open now for private purposes only. No limousines line the street on weekend evenings. No helicopters descend onto the lawn. The peacocks that once wandered the grounds, symbols of the exotic atmosphere Hefner cultivated, are gone. The silence that the neighborhood always sought has finally settled over the property, permanent and complete. Those who remember the mansion as it was are aging now, their memories increasingly distant from a present that has little use for what they witnessed. The celebrities who attended the parties have their own legacies to manage, their own relationships with a past that looks different in retrospect than it did at the time. The women who lived there carry their experiences forward into lives shaped by what they encountered within those walls, some successfully, others with greater difficulty, all marked in ways that outsiders cannot fully comprehend. Their testimonies remain, recorded in interviews and memoirs, available to anyone who wishes to understand what the mythology concealed. The cultural moment that produced the Playboy Mansion and sustained it for more than 4 decades has passed. The assumptions that made it possible about masculinity, about female availability, about the relationship between wealth and access to bodies have not disappeared, but they can no longer be expressed with the same ease or celebrated with the same impunity. What Hefner built was always contingent on a particular configuration of power, money, and media attention. When that configuration shifted, the entire edifice lost its foundation. The mansion was the last physical remnant of a world that existed